December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium.
5:30 am.
The ground shook before the sound arrived. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front, and the men of the American 8th Corps who had been sleeping in their foxholes woke up to what many of them described later as the end of the world. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. Trees exploded into wooden shrapnel. Frozen ground erupted in geysers of dirt and ice. Communication lines were severed in the first minutes. Command posts lost contact with forward units. The carefully constructed American defensive line that stretched through the Ardennes dissolved into isolated pockets of men who no longer knew where their units were, where the enemy was, or what was happening anywhere beyond the range of their own vision. What was happening was the largest German offensive operation on the Western Front since the fall of France in 1940. Adolf Hitler, against the unanimous advice of his generals, had committed 32 divisions, 250,000 men, and his last strategic reserve of armor and fuel to a single massive gamble. The objective was the port of Antwerp, Belgium. If Germany could reach Antwerp, it could cut the Allied supply lines, split the American and British forces, and force a negotiated peace before Soviet armies completed their advance from the east. Hitler called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. American soldiers, who would spend the next 6 weeks fighting through the coldest winter in European memory, would call it the Battle of the Bulge. What neither Hitler nor his generals could have predicted was that the geographic center of their offensive, the critical road junction town of Bastogne, Belgium, would be defended by 11,000 American soldiers who would become the most celebrated surrounded force in the history of the United States Army. Or that their commander, Brigadier General McAuliffe, would respond to a formal German surrender demand with a single word that would become one of the most famous utterances in American military history. Or that those 11,000 men would hold for 8 days in temperatures that dropped to -20 degrees, without adequate food, without adequate ammunition, without adequate medical supplies, surrounded by 5 German divisions, until the tanks of General George Patton's Third Army crashed through the German lines and proved that the Americans that Hitler had dismissed as too soft to fight a real war were capable of something that no German military planner had ever adequately accounted for. They were capable of refusing to quit. To understand what happened at Bastogne, you have to understand what the Ardennes meant to American commanders in December 1944. The forest that stretched across Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany was considered by Allied planners to be a quiet sector. The terrain was too difficult for major offensive operations. The roads were too narrow and too few for large armored formations. The forest itself limited visibility and made coordination nearly impossible. It was, in the military terminology of the time, a rest sector, a place to put divisions that needed to recover from hard fighting elsewhere, a place where green divisions could be introduced to combat gradually before being sent to more active fronts. The 8th Corps defending the Ardennes in December 1944 reflected this assessment. It was a mixed force of exhausted veterans and untested newcomers stretched across a front that was far wider than standard military doctrine considered defensible. The 106th Infantry Division had been in Europe for less than a week, its men still learning the difference between training and combat. The 28th Infantry Division had just come out of the brutal Hurtgen forest fighting and was badly under strength. The 4th Infantry Division was similarly depleted. Intelligence reports had noted German activity behind the Ardennes front, but had interpreted it as defensive preparations rather than offensive buildup. German security for the offensive had been extraordinary. Units moved only at night. Radio silence was maintained. Aircraft that might have revealed the buildup were grounded by weather that also grounded American reconnaissance flights. The 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks that Hitler had assembled behind the Ardennes front were essentially invisible to American intelligence until the moment they attacked. The initial German assault was devastating. The 106th Infantry Division, the Green Division that had been in Europe for less than a week, was overwhelmed by German forces that outnumbered it massively. 2 of its 3 regiments, more than 8,000 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender in the largest mass surrender of American troops since the Civil War. The 28th Division was shattered. Gaps appeared in the American line that German armored columns poured through, driving west toward the Meuse River and, beyond it, Antwerp. For 48 hours, the situation was as close to catastrophic as the Western Allied corps would come in the entire war. Eisenhower's headquarters struggled to understand the scope of what was happening. Communication failures meant that reports were incomplete, contradictory, and hours out of date. The most alarming intelligence was the simplest. German armor was moving west, fast, and there was not enough American force in place to stop it. The town of Bastogne sat at the center of everything. 7 major roads converged at Bastogne, making it the critical hub through which any large force moving through the Ardennes had to pass. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the central Ardennes. The Germans needed it to move supplies and reinforcements to their advancing spearheads. The Americans needed to deny it to them. On December 17th, one day after the offensive began, Eisenhower made the decision that would determine the battle. He ordered the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, then resting and refitting near Reims, France after the brutal fighting at Market Garden, to move immediately to the Ardennes. The 82nd would go north to Werbermont. The 101st would go to Bastogne. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night with incomplete equipment, without winter clothing adequate for the temperatures they were about to face, without full ammunition loads, without the supplies that standard doctrine required before committing a unit to combat. They rode through the night toward a battle whose shape none of them fully understood, passing columns of American soldiers moving in the opposite direction, retreating from the German advance, some of them in panic, some of them in shock, all of them conveying by their movement the message that something had gone terribly wrong. The 101st arrived in Bastogne on December 19th and immediately began establishing a defensive perimeter around the town. Their commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington for a conference. Brigadier General McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander, was in charge. McAuliffe was 50 years old, a West Point graduate who had commanded the 101 Estes artillery since before Normandy. He was not, by any account, a dramatic or theatrical man. He was calm, methodical, and possessed of the particular quality that distinguished good commanders from great ones, the ability to make clear decisions under circumstances of radical uncertainty without either freezing in place or acting rashly. What McAuliffe was inheriting was a situation that most commanders would have considered untenable. Bastogne was surrounded by December 21st. The German 2nd Panzer Division had bypassed the town to the north, racing for the Meuse. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division pressed from the east. The Panzer-Lehr Division attacked from the south. The 116th Panzer Division threatened from the northwest. 5 German divisions, with more arriving, had encircled a force that lacked adequate supplies, adequate winter equipment, and a clear line of retreat. The perimeter the 101st established around Bastogne was approximately 16 miles in circumference, defended by 11,000 men against German forces that outnumbered them significantly. The American positions were dug into frozen ground that resisted entrenching tools, in temperatures that caused wounds to freeze and made frostbite as dangerous as enemy fire. Artillery ammunition was rationed from the first day. Medical supplies ran out within 48 hours of the encirclement. The division's medical company had been captured intact, along with its equipment and personnel, in the opening hours of the battle. The fighting that surrounded Bastogne during those 8 days of encirclement was some of the most brutal and intimate of the entire European campaign. German attacks came from multiple directions, probing for weaknesses, hitting defended positions with armor and infantry in combinations that were designed to find the breaking point of the American line. The defenders responded by shifting units from quiet sectors to threatened ones, counterattacking when German forces penetrated the perimeter, holding ground that military logic said could not be held. At Neuville, a village north of Bastogne, Team Desabry of the 10th Armored Division held against repeated German armored attacks for 2 days, destroying dozens of tanks and killing hundreds of German soldiers before withdrawing through Bastogne's perimeter. The fog that covered the Ardennes during most of the siege prevented American air support and made long-range visibility impossible, which meant German armor could approach American positions before being engaged. The men in the foxholes fought in conditions that defy easy description. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow covered the frozen ground. The fog that denied them air support also disoriented patrols and made maintaining contact between units difficult.
Frostbite casualty accumulated alongside combat casualty.
Men whose feet had frozen solid walked on them anyway because there was no alternative. Medics treated wounds with inadequate supplies, improvising with whatever they could find. The dead were laid beside the roads because there was no time and no resources to bury them. And yet the line held. It held because of individuals making individual decisions that collectively added up to something larger than any of them understood while it was happening. It held because sergeants kept their squads fighting when officers were killed or wounded. It held because artillery officers coordinated fire with such precision that German attacks that should have overwhelmed defensive positions were broken before they reached the American lines. It held because the particular culture of the 101st Airborne, the culture of men who had jumped into Normandy and Holland and understood that being surrounded was not necessarily fatal, refused to communicate the despair that the situation objectively warranted. On December 22, 1944, 4 German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal written demand for surrender addressed to the American commander of Bastogne. The demand was courteous, even respectful in tone. It acknowledged the courage of the American defenders. It noted the hopelessness of their situation. It offered honorable surrender terms and warned that continued resistance would result in the annihilation of the garrison. The message was delivered to McAuliffe, who read it and said, according to those present, "Or nuts." Then he had to compose a formal written reply. McAuliffe's response, typed on official stationery and delivered back to the German officers by his acting chief of staff Colonel Joseph Harper, consisted of a single word: nuts. Harper, concerned that the Germans might not understand the American colloquial expression, translated for them. It means the same as "go to hell." The German officers were confused and then insulted. Harper told them that if they continued to attack, the Americans would kill every one of them. Then he walked back to the American lines. McAuliffe's response became one of the defining moments of the Battle of the Bulge, not because it was militarily significant, but because it captured something essential about the American fighting spirit that the Germans had never adequately understood. Surrounded, undersupplied, outnumbered, facing an enemy that possessed every material advantage, the American commander had responded to a demand for surrender with something between contempt and humor. The Germans attacked again. The line held again. The weather broke on December 23rd. Clear skies over the Ardennes meant American air power could finally operate, and the effect was immediate and dramatic. C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies to the besieged garrison, bundles of ammunition, food, and medical supplies that fell from the sky to men who had been conserving every round and stretching every ration for days. Fighter bombers attacked German armored columns and supply lines, destroying vehicles and disrupting the logistics that German forces depended on. The psychological impact of American aircraft overhead after days of fog-enforced isolation was as significant as the material relief. But air supply could not end the siege. Only ground forces could do that, and the question was whether those ground forces could arrive before German pressure finally broke the Bastogne perimeter. The answer was being assembled 100 miles to the south, where General George Patton was performing what military historians would later describe as the most impressive feat of operational movement in the history of armored warfare. Patton had been summoned to Eisenhower's emergency conference on December 19th, the same day the 101st was entering Bastogne. When Eisenhower asked how long it would take Patton to disengage his Third Army from its current offensive operations, turn 90 degrees north, and attack to relieve Bastogne, Patton said 48 hours. The room was silent. Generals don't turn entire armies 90 degrees in 48 hours. Corps don't move that fast. Divisions don't move that fast. Attacking forces don't disengage, reorient, and resume offensive operations in 48 hours. It wasn't done. It couldn't be done. Patton had already given the orders before he left for the conference. His staff had prepared 3 contingency plans for exactly this scenario, knowing that the German offensive might require a rapid reorientation of Third Army's axis of advance. When Patton picked up the telephone at the conference and called his headquarters to execute Plan 3, his corps commanders already knew what was expected of them. Units that had been attacking east turned north. Supply lines were rerouted overnight. Artillery was repositioned. The vast machinery of an American armored army changed direction with a speed that German military science considered impossible. The 4th Armored Division, which would form the tip of Patton's relief column, began its attack northward on December 22nd. What followed was 4 days of brutal fighting through German positions that had been established specifically to prevent exactly what Patton was attempting. The Germans knew that relief was coming from the south. They had positioned forces to block the roads. The terrain channeled the American advance into corridors that the defenders had pre-registered with artillery. The 4th Armored Division fought through it anyway. The combination of American armor, artillery, and infantry coordination that had been developing since Normandy was now operating at a level of effectiveness that German forces were increasingly unable to match. Positions that held against the first attack were flanked and hit from multiple directions simultaneously. German tank destroyers that stopped one axis of advance found themselves under attack from another. The advance was measured in miles per day rather than the miles per hour that Patton's ambitions demanded, but it was steady and it was irreversible. On the evening of December 26, 1944, Sergeant Oswald Butler of the 37th Tank Battalion spotted lights ahead through his tank commander's vision block. He reported what he was seeing. His company commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later command American forces in Vietnam and give his name to the tank that replaced the Shermans his men were driving that night, ordered the advance to continue. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26th, the first tanks of the 4th Armored Division made contact with the 101st Airborne Division's perimeter at a small village called Airdennes, southwest of Bastogne. The siege was broken. The relief was not the end of the fighting. It was more accurate to say that it was the end of one phase and the beginning of another. German forces continued to press the Bastogne perimeter for weeks. The town itself came under artillery fire that destroyed much of it. The battle for the Ardennes continued into January 1945, with American forces gradually eliminating the German penetration that had seemed so catastrophic in those first hours of December 16th. But the strategic decision had been made at Bastogne. Hitler's gamble had failed. The 32 German divisions that had been committed to the offensive had suffered casualties they could not replace. The armor that had been the Reich's last strategic reserve was burning in the Ardennes. The fuel that had been hoarded for months had been consumed. The experienced officers and NCOs who had been needed to train the Wehrmacht's last generation of soldiers were dead in the snow. The cost had been enormous on both sides. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge totaled approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, and captured. German casualties were roughly equal, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to 100,000. The Ardennes in December and January was one of the most lethal environments in the history of American arms, and the men who fought there paid for every mile in frozen blood. What they bought with that blood was the end of Germany's ability to wage offensive warfare in the West. After the Bulge, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive everywhere. There were no more strategic reserves. There was no more fuel for the panzers. There were no more experienced pilots for the Luftwaffe. There were no more options that didn't involve trading space for time on a map that was running out of space. The German generals who had planned the offensive knew this before it started. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who was nominally in command of the operation, had called it a gamble that he didn't believe would succeed. He was right. He had told Hitler that the most they could realistically achieve was a limited success that might slow the Allied advance. What they achieved instead was the destruction of their last reserves in an offensive that failed to reach even its intermediate objectives. Bastogne had held. And because Bastogne had held, the road network through the central Ardennes had been denied to the Germans at the critical moment when they needed it most. German armoured columns that might have broken through to the Meuse had instead been diverted around the town, adding time and fuel consumption to their advance. The delay had allowed Eisenhower to move reserves to threatened sectors. It had allowed Patton to organize his relief operation. It had given the Allied command the time it needed to understand what was happening and respond. The men who held Bastogne did not fully understand any of this while they were doing it. They understood their foxholes and their immediate sectors and the Germans who were attacking them. They understood the cold and the shortage of ammunition and the inadequacy of their winter clothing. They understood the men beside them and the men they had lost and the men they were still responsible for. Sergeant James Gibson of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, interviewed decades after the battle, described the experience with the simplicity that combat veterans often find more honest than elaborate description. We didn't know what was happening 10 miles away. We knew what was happening in front of us. Germans were trying to get through us. We didn't let them. That was it. That was the whole thing. But it was not, of course, the whole thing. It was 11,000 men holding a 16-mile perimeter in -20-degree temperatures without adequate supplies against 5 German divisions for 8 days while history turned on what they were doing. It was McAuliffe reading a surrender demand and saying nuts and meaning it, not as bravado but as simple statement of fact. It was Patton's army turning 90 degrees overnight because Patton had already planned for it and his men were capable of executing it. It was the particular, stubborn, furious American unwillingness to accept the logical conclusion of a situation that looked hopeless. Bastogne looked hopeless in December 1944. The Germans had every material advantage. They had more men, more tanks, more artillery, and a completely surrounded enemy that was running out of everything. The logical outcome was an American defeat that would have significantly prolonged the war in Europe and cost tens of thousands of additional lives. The logical outcome did not happen. It did not happen because 11,000 Americans decided it wasn't going to happen, and because one American general responded to a surrender demand with a word that has echoed through military history ever since. In December 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, veterans of the 101st Airborne Division returned to Bastogne. They were old men by then, most of them in their 70s, some of them in wheelchairs, all of them carrying inside them the specific memories of specific foxholes and specific cold and specific friends who had not made it back. The town of Bastogne had built a memorial to the American soldiers who had defended it. The Mardassen Memorial, a massive star-shaped structure overlooking the fields where the fighting had been worst, was inscribed with the names of every American unit that had fought in the Battle of the Bulge. One of the veterans, a former private in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment who declined to give his name to the journalist interviewing him, stood in front of the memorial for a long time without speaking. When he finally talked, he said something that captured what Bastogne meant, not as military history but as human experience. We were cold. We were hungry. We didn't have enough bullets. And the Germans wanted us to quit. He paused. We didn't think that was a good enough reason. That is Bastogne. That is the Battle of the Bulge. That is what American soldiers are made of when everything else has been stripped away and all that's left is the cold and the enemy and the choice of whether to quit or not. They didn't quit. The Germans found that out. And the war in Europe was never the same again.